It was the autumn of 1998, somewhere deep in the hills of northern Montana. I was 32 that year, and after working in construction for nearly a decade, I'd grown tired of the noise, the crowds, and the endless grind of city life. I wanted something quiet, something I could build with my own hands and live in peace with for a while. I had saved enough money to buy a small patch of land near an old logging trail that hadn't been used in decades. The place was overgrown, thick with pine trees and brush, but it had one clear spot near a creek where I decided I'd build a small cabin. It wasn't much of a plan, just a thought that I'd follow as far as it would take me. By late September, the nights had grown cold, and the air had that sharp smell that comes before long rain. I had been camping on site for 2 weeks, sleeping in a canvas tent while I worked each day. The cabin frame was up by then. Rough-cut lumber I'd milled myself, nailed and fitted together in a simple square. I had the roof halfway done, a pile of old metal sheets stacked near the fire pit, ready to be nailed down the next morning. Everything smelled of wet dirt and pine sap. My hands were blistered, my back sore, but I felt good, like I was doing something real for once. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the trees, I noticed the sky had turned a deep, bruised gray. I'd felt the air change, the wind dropped, and a low rumble rolled across the distance. A storm was coming fast. I gathered what tools I could carry and stuffed the rest into a plastic tarp under the half-built porch. The tent flapped hard in the wind while I hammered down the last stake and zipped myself inside. My flashlight beam flickered over the inside of the tent. Damp clothes, a small propane stove, my sleeping bag already cold from the evening air. The rain started slow, tapping against the tent like fingertips. Within minutes, it turned heavy, pounding against the ground until it drowned out every other sound. The creek behind the clearing swelled quickly, roaring louder as the water rushed past the rocks. My tent shuddered with every gust of wind. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up inside me, telling myself it was just another storm. But when you're out there alone, miles from the nearest road, every noise, every creak starts to sound like something more. I decided to move inside the unfinished cabin. It had 4 solid walls, even if the roof was still patchy. I grabbed my lantern, a blanket, and a small tin of food, then ran through the rain toward the cabin. The mud clung to my boots, heavy and cold. By the time I reached the doorway, the rain had soaked me completely. I stepped inside and lit the lantern. The yellow light flickered across the rough wooden walls, revealing the dark stains where water dripped through the open roof. The smell of wet wood filled the air, sharp and earthy. I sat against the far wall, wrapping the blanket around myself, listening to the storm rage outside. The hours dragged on. Thunder rolled across the hills, and lightning flashed through the cracks in the roof, lighting up the inside for a split second before leaving it dark again. Each flash showed something different. A saw leaning against the wall, the bucket of nails, my pack in the corner. It was strange how those normal things could look so unfamiliar in that kind of light, almost unsettling. I kept checking the door even though there was nothing out there but trees and rain. My mind started playing tricks on me. The wind made the forest sound alive, branches snapping, leaves hissing, the distant creak of something moving. I knew it was probably just the wind, but that didn't make it easier to ignore. Sometime around midnight, the rain got heavier. I could hear the creek flooding, the water slapping against the banks hard enough to carry branches downstream. I thought about leaving, maybe driving to town and sleeping in the truck, but the trail out was too rough and narrow. I wasn't about to risk getting stuck halfway in the dark, so I stayed. I tried to lie down on the floorboards, but the cold had settled deep into the wood. Every breath came out like smoke in the lantern light. I could feel the damp seeping through my blanket, my clothes clinging to my skin. I kept thinking how strange it was, that I'd come out here to find peace and ended up sitting alone in a half-built shack in the middle of a storm, wondering what in the world I was doing. Around 2 in the morning, I noticed something off. The hammer I'd left by the wall wasn't where I remembered putting it. It had been lying near the doorway earlier, but now it was on the opposite side, next to the stack of lumber. I stared at it for a long time, trying to think if I'd moved it without realizing. Maybe I'd kicked it earlier or shifted it when I brought my things in. That had to be it. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't right. My heartbeat picked up, and I found myself glancing toward the doorway again. Then I heard it. Something outside, faint but distinct. A soft crunch, like footsteps in wet dirt. Slow, careful, not the kind of sound you mistake for rain. Came from somewhere near the trees, then stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I held my breath and listened hard, every muscle tight. The storm made it almost impossible to tell how close it was. I tried to convince myself it was a deer, maybe something looking for shelter. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Minutes passed. The sound didn't come again. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. I turned down the lantern, just enough to keep a dim light, and sat with my back against the wall. I stayed that way for what felt like hours, barely moving, just listening. The rain eased a little toward dawn, replaced by a steady dripping from the roof. My eyelids grew heavy, and at some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke, the sky outside was still gray but lighter, the storm mostly gone. The forest was soaked, and the creek had spilled over its banks, leaving muddy pools all over the clearing. I stepped outside, stretching my stiff legs, and looked around. The air was cold and still except for the dripping trees. I noticed footprints near the cabin, fresh ones, pressed deep into the mud. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, leading from the edge of the forest straight to the doorway. There were no prints going back, just a line of heavy steps that stopped right where I'd been sitting inside. My chest went tight. I stood there for a long time, staring at those footprints, trying to understand what I was looking at. The edges of the prints were sharp, meaning they'd been made during the night, maybe when the rain had slowed. Whoever it was must have been close enough to see the lantern light through the cracks. I walked around the cabin, looking for any sign of someone still nearby, but there was nothing, just wet ground, fallen branches, and silence. The forest had that eerie calm it gets after a storm, where every sound seems too clear. I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't even bother taking down the tent. It was half collapsed anyway. I loaded what I could into the truck and left the rest behind. The tires slipped in the mud as I drove down the trail, the trees closing in on both sides. My hands were shaking the whole way down the hill. I kept looking in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing, just the gray morning and the mist rising off the wet ground. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over and sat for a while, engine idling, staring at my hands. The rain had started again, lighter this time. I thought about going back for the rest of my tools, maybe finishing the cabin when the weather cleared, but I never did. I sold the land 2 months later, cheap. I never said why. Sometimes, when it rains hard at night, I still think about that half-built cabin in the woods, about the footprints that led to the door and stopped there. I try to tell myself it was nothing, just some hunter or lost traveler passing through. But deep down, I know that whoever stood out there that night wasn't lost. They had been watching, waiting, and that thought has stayed with me ever since. It was early October of 2014 when I got assigned to a remote post deep inside the San Juan National Forest in Colorado. I'd been working as a park ranger for 6 years at that point, used to long nights, unpredictable weather, and the uneasy quiet that comes with being alone in miles of wilderness. But nothing really prepared me for that particular assignment. A small, outdated cabin meant to serve as a monitoring station for a section of forest that hadn't seen regular patrol in years. The cabin sat at the end of a rough gravel road, a good 2-hour drive from the main ranger station. It was tucked between tall pine trees, about half a mile from a narrow river that twisted through the forest like a black ribbon. The structure was simple, just a single-story log building with a tin roof, a narrow porch, and an old generator around the back. Inside, there was a small kitchen, a cot, a desk with an old radio, and shelves lined with water testing kits, notebooks, and wildlife reports that probably hadn't been updated in over a decade. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already low, bleeding orange light through the trees. My assignment was to spend 3 weeks out there, checking water quality from nearby streams and keeping records of wildlife movement in the area. It sounded simple enough. The other rangers warned me that cell signal was basically non-existent, so the only way to reach the main station was through the shortwave radio, which I tested as soon as I arrived. Crackled with static but worked fine. That first night, I remember the air feeling heavy. The forest was absolutely still, except for the faint drip of water from the eaves. I cooked some canned soup on the gas stove and sat on the porch, listening to the quiet. When you're alone out there, the silence almost starts to feel like a sound in itself, pressing against you, filling your ears, reminding you just how far you are from anything. The next morning, I started my rounds early. I carried a pack with testing gear and hiked toward a stream about a mile north. The forest was dense, with thick undergrowth and patches of fog that lingered in the low spots. I didn't see much wildlife, just the occasional squirrel darting across the trail. The ground was soft and damp from recent rain, and I noticed boot tracks near the stream, old maybe a few days. It wasn't unusual. Hunters sometimes wandered close to the restricted areas despite warnings. I made a note of it and moved on. By evening, the weather turned. The sky darkened faster than usual, and by nightfall, heavy rain was falling in sheets. The sound of it drumming against the metal roof was deafening. I shut off the generator early because the noise mixed with the storm made it impossible to relax. I lit a lantern and sat by the window, watching the rain run down the glass. Every so often, I thought I saw movement between the trees, shadows shifting where there shouldn't have been any. It was probably just the wind, I told myself, though the wind didn't usually move with that kind of purpose. Around midnight, I went outside to check that the generator's tarp hadn't blown off. The rain was cold, and the flashlight beam cut through it like a thin blade. I could smell wet pine and diesel, and the mud sucked at my boots as I walked around back. Everything seemed fine, but when I turned to head back in, I noticed something strange. A single muddy boot print right near the porch steps. It wasn't mine. It was larger, deeper, like someone heavier had been standing there recently. The rain should have washed it away if it had been there for long, so it had to be fresh. My stomach tightened a bit. I scanned the treeline but saw nothing, just darkness and the endless sound of rain. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat for a while with the lantern burning low. The next morning, the rain had stopped, and the forest looked washed clean. I stepped out and checked around the cabin. The boot print was still faintly visible, but there were no other tracks nearby, no signs of anyone passing through. I walked a short way down the gravel road, just to be sure, but found nothing. I told myself it could have been left by an old hiker before the storm started, though that didn't explain how it looked so new. The second week passed slowly. The routine was simple but tiring. Every day, I'd collect samples, check motion cameras, and log weather readings. I kept noticing little things that made me uneasy. Tools moved from where I left them. A chair slightly turned toward the window one morning. The generator fuel level dropping faster than I remembered using it. Nothing that screamed danger, just small, unsettling details that started to build in my head. Then one night, just past 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't the wind or rain this time. It was softer, more deliberate, the sound of gravel crunching under slow, heavy steps. I sat up in the cot, heart pounding. The lantern was still burning low, throwing dim light across the cabin. I didn't move for several minutes, just listening. The steps stopped somewhere near the porch. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. I didn't hear any door handle rattle, didn't hear retreating footsteps. Nothing. After a while, I gathered enough courage to move toward the window, keeping the light low. The rain from earlier had turned the ground soft, and the moonlight caught on the wet earth. That's when I saw it, 2 fresh footprints right near the steps, facing the door. Whoever it was had been standing there, watching. I didn't sleep after that. At sunrise, I went outside to look again. The prints were deep, like whoever made them had been wearing heavy boots. I followed them a short distance down the path until they veered off into the trees, fading into the thick brush. I marked the location on my map and decided to report it over the radio. The signal was weak that morning, and I couldn't get through clearly. The static swallowed most of my words, but I think they understood enough. Possible trespasser near northern boundary. The following night was the worst. Started calm, almost too calm. The forest felt dead quiet, not even crickets. I was reading through old field notes when I heard a faint metallic sound outside, like something brushing against the generator. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out slowly. The air was cold, my breath coming out in short clouds. The beam of light cut across the clearing, and for a moment, I thought I caught movement at the edge of the trees. A figure tall and still. But when I blinked, it was gone. I walked around the generator, checked the fuel tank, and froze when I noticed the latch had been loosened. Someone had been trying to open it. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied. That was enough for me. I backed up toward the cabin and locked myself inside. Hours passed. The forest outside stayed quiet, too quiet. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn came, I packed what I could and drove down the gravel road toward the main station. The ranger who met me there said no one else was assigned anywhere near that section of the forest. No patrols, no survey teams, nothing. A few days later, another ranger went to check the cabin. He called me that evening. He said the front door had deep scratches in it, like someone had dragged a blade or metal object across the wood. He also found a single boot lying near the porch, muddy, size 12, old military issue. That section of forest was closed off for a while after that. They never figured out who had been out there. No missing persons, no illegal camps, no reports from nearby towns. Just a few scattered footprints and that boot. I still think about it sometimes, especially on rainy nights. I can still see the dark shape by the trees, still hear the slow steps on the gravel. People think the forest is peaceful, quiet, untouched. But when you spend enough nights alone in it, you realize how little you really know about what moves between the trees after dark. And when the silence comes down heavy, like it did that night, you start to understand that sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't what you can't explain. It's what you can. It was early November when I decided to drive out to the old hunting grounds near the northern edge of Montana. I'd taken the trip years ago with a few friends, but this time I went alone. I needed space. Things in my life had been piling up. Work stress, a breakup, constant noise in the city, and the idea of being cut off in the woods for a few days sounded right. I had a small 4-wheel drive truck, a sleeping bag, and enough canned food for the weekend. The plan was simple. Stay in one of the old cabins near Lake Banner, fish a bit, clear my head, then drive home Sunday evening. The road there was mostly dirt once I passed the small town of Woodfield. My phone lost service about 10 miles out. The air had that dry, brittle cold that always shows up right before winter. Most of the trees had shed their leaves, leaving the forest bare and gray. Around 3 in the afternoon, I reached a clearing where the old cabins stood. There were 4 of them once, all built in the 1960s, but only one still had its roof mostly intact. The others had collapsed under time and weather. I parked near the largest cabin. Its walls were dark with age, boards warped and splitting in places. The steps leading to the porch had moss growing between the planks. The windows were filthy, one cracked all the way across. When I opened the door, it scraped hard against the floor, like it hadn't moved in years. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying that strong smell of old wood and dirt. There was an iron stove in one corner, a broken chair, and a small table covered in dust. I unpacked my gear, set up my sleeping bag on the floor, and started cleaning a bit. I remember thinking that it wasn't so bad for something abandoned this long. By sunset, the woods were dead quiet, not even the usual bird calls. I cooked a can of beans on a small camp stove and ate by lantern light. The night came down heavy and fast. The wind outside moved through the trees, and the sound of branches scraping against the cabin made me uneasy. Every small noise seemed louder out there. Around 10, I decided to step outside for a bit of air. The moon was high, giving off just enough light to see the clearing. My breath came out in white clouds. I noticed something odd on the side of the cabin. A deep scratch running down one of the planks, like something had dragged metal across it. I crouched to look closer and realized it wasn't new. It had been there for years. The edges were weathered, gray like the rest of the wood. It didn't seem like a big deal, but for some reason it bothered me. I went back inside, locked the door latch from the inside, and tried to sleep. Took a while. Every creak made my muscles tense. I must have dozed off sometime past midnight because I woke up suddenly to a dull thud. It wasn't loud, just heavy enough to feel through the floor. My first thought was that something had fallen from the roof. Then I heard another, slower this time, from the other side of the wall. A steady rhythm, like someone dragging their feet on wood. My body froze. I sat there in the dark, barely breathing. I kept telling myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer bumping against the cabin or a raccoon scavenging. After a few minutes, it stopped. I didn't hear anything else. I checked my watch. It was 2:17 a.m. The air inside felt colder than before. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, staring at the faint outlines of the window until a thin gray light came through. When morning finally came, I went outside to check around. The ground was damp from frost, and I could see my footprints from yesterday. But there were other marks too. Not shoe prints, not animal tracks either. They looked like scuff marks, long and irregular, leading from the back of the cabin toward the tree line. The dirt was disturbed like something had been dragged. I followed the marks for about 20 feet before they disappeared into leaves and dead grass. I stood there for a long time trying to reason it out. Maybe some old equipment left by hunters? Maybe an animal dragging something it caught? It didn't make much sense, but I forced myself to ignore it. I tried to distract myself with fishing down by the lake that afternoon. The water was calm, and the air was still cold. The lake was about half a mile from the cabin, surrounded by thick forest. While I was there, I found an old metal bucket half buried in mud, full of rusted hooks and line. It looked like no one had fished there in years. I caught nothing, packed up, and walked back just before dark. When I got close to the cabin, I noticed something different. The door was slightly open. I knew I had shut it tightly when I left. My chest tightened as I walked up the steps. I pushed the door open slowly. Everything inside looked the same at first. My gear was where I left it, but the chair that had been in the corner was now lying on its side. Dust had been disturbed across the floor in thin trails, like something had been moved or dragged lightly. My sleeping bag was still there, but the end of it looked wrinkled and pushed out, as if something had been under it. I checked every corner, the closet, even the stove, but nothing. I didn't find a single sign of anyone or anything. I remember standing in the center of the cabin, feeling my heartbeat echo in my ears, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe wind pushed the door open. Maybe a small animal came in. I tried to calm down, but my instincts wouldn't settle. I decided I'd sleep in the truck that night instead. As it got dark again, I loaded everything back into the truck and parked facing the dirt road. The temperature dropped below freezing. I left the engine off to save fuel and covered myself with a blanket. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of movement again. It wasn't from inside the truck. It was outside, near the porch, a slow crunching of gravel. My chest went tight. I couldn't see much through the windshield because of the fog on the glass, so I wiped it with my sleeve. There was someone standing near the cabin steps. I couldn't make out much detail in the dark, just the shape, tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin, their back toward me. The air felt frozen. I didn't move or even breathe for what felt like minutes. Then the figure turned its head slightly, not fully, just enough to catch a glimpse of the side of their face. Pale, sharp, hollow looking. I didn't wait to see more. I started the engine and pressed down hard on the gas. The tires kicked up dirt and gravel as I sped down that road. The rearview mirror shook, but I didn't look back. I drove until I reached the paved road near Woodfield and stopped only when I saw the first streetlight. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. I sat there until the sun came up, trying to make sense of it. Later that morning, I went to a small gas station to fill up. The guy working there asked if I had been out near Lake Banner. When I said yes, he nodded slowly and said the cabins had been empty since the late 80s. He mentioned a man who used to live out there alone for years after the others left. Some old hunter who refused to move when the Forest Service shut down the property. No one ever knew what happened to him. They found his cabin abandoned one winter, with his tools and things still inside, but no sign of him. I didn't tell him what I saw. I just nodded, paid, and drove home. It's been months since that night, but the image of that figure still sticks in my mind. The way it stood there in silence, as if it wasn't supposed to be seen. I've thought about going back, just to prove to myself that there was nothing out there. But every time I picture that cabin, I feel that same cold rise up in my chest. Maybe it was just someone passing through. Maybe some squatter who found shelter for the night. But the one thing that keeps me from convincing myself it was nothing, the tracks I saw behind the cabin the next morning were deep. Too deep for light shoes or boots. Like something heavy had been dragged through the dirt, again and again, until the ground gave way. And I don't ever want to know what it was. It was late autumn 2018 when I decided to take a week off from work and stay alone in a small cabin I had rented in the countryside of Cumbria, up in the north of England. I was 32 then, worn down by long hours in an office that felt more like a cage than a career. The cabin was cheap and tucked away near a forested hillside, about a half-hour drive from the nearest town. The pictures online made it look peaceful. Just a wooden structure by a narrow dirt road, with a stone chimney and moss creeping up the sides. I wanted quiet, a place where my phone barely worked, and no one could bother me. That's exactly what I got, but not in the way I expected. The first 2 days went fine. It rained most of the time, the kind of slow, constant drizzle that never stopped. The air smelled like wet soil and pine. The cabin itself was old, probably built in the 70s, judging by the furniture. Scratched wooden tables, yellowed curtains, a faint smell of dust and dampness. I spent my days hiking the nearby trails and my nights reading or just sitting by the small electric heater, listening to the rain hit the roof. The area was almost deserted. A few other cabins stood down the road, but they looked empty. No lights, no sounds, nothing. By the third night, the quiet started to feel too heavy. The kind of silence where even your own movements sound loud. I was sitting by the window, drinking tea, when I noticed something strange outside. Through the faint reflection of my own face in the glass, I saw movement near the tree line. Not quick, but slow, deliberate. Someone was standing there. At first, I thought it was a shadow from the branches swaying in the wind, but it wasn't moving like that. The figure was still, facing toward the cabin. I leaned closer to the window, squinting through the drizzle. The figure seemed small, maybe a woman, wearing what looked like a long coat or dress that blended into the darkness. I stared for a long time, thinking maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But when I looked away for a second and then back, she had shifted, a few feet to the side, closer to the path that led toward the cabin. My stomach tightened. I told myself there could be a logical reason. Maybe a local, someone walking home, maybe even a hiker who got lost. But something about her posture didn't seem right. She was too still. I turned off the light to see better, but when I did, I couldn't see her anymore. The trees swayed, and the darkness thickened until everything outside melted into black. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak from the cabin sounded like footsteps outside. The old floorboards popped and shifted with the wind, but each noise made me tense up. Around 2 a.m., I heard what I thought was the sound of gravel crunching near the porch. Faint but distinct, like someone stepping carefully. I froze in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then silence. I waited a long time before drifting off again, uneasy. The next morning, the rain had stopped. Everything was damp and foggy, a thick mist covering the ground. I went outside, trying to convince myself I'd imagined everything. The air was cold enough to sting my face. That's when I noticed the ground near the front steps. Small, uneven footprints in the mud. Not from boots or sneakers, they looked like bare feet. The sight of them made my chest tighten. The prints led from the path toward the cabin and then disappeared near the porch. I crouched down, staring at them, feeling this strange mix of disbelief and fear. No one would be walking barefoot out there in that cold. I thought about leaving, packing up early, but I tried to be logical. Maybe someone had come up here drunk. Maybe some local woman from the village wandering around, or maybe a teenager trying to scare people. It didn't make sense, but it was easier to tell myself that than admit how much it bothered me. That evening, I went to the small town to get some groceries and clear my head. The drive took about 40 minutes, winding through empty fields and narrow roads. When I came back around dusk, the fog had rolled in again, thicker than before. My headlights cut through it in narrow beams. When I reached the cabin, something immediately felt off. The front door was closed. I always locked it, but the handle looked wet, as if someone had been touching it with muddy hands. I stood there for a while, engine still running, just staring at the door. Inside, everything looked the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I checked every corner, every window. Nothing missing, nothing moved. Still, the air felt different, like someone had just been inside a few minutes before. The heater was still on, humming softly, and that sound was the only thing that kept me from losing it. I locked the door again and sat down, facing the window. Around midnight, I saw her again. The same figure, standing near the edge of the forest, motionless. This time, I could see more clearly. She was wearing an old-fashioned coat that looked almost gray, her hair long and tangled, hanging down. She wasn't close enough to see her face, but I could tell she was looking straight toward the cabin. My stomach dropped, and I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I didn't move. I just sat there, trying not to blink. After what felt like hours, I couldn't see her anymore. The fog swallowed her whole. I turned every light off, locked myself in the bedroom, and waited until the first bit of daylight came through the curtains. When I went outside in the morning, the footprints were back, this time fresh, in the wet mud right by the steps. I didn't even bother checking around the cabin anymore. I packed my bag, stuffed everything into the car, and drove off. The road back was empty. My hands were shaking the entire time, my throat dry. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing somewhere along the road. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I booked a cheap motel room and stayed there that night, too nervous to drive back home in the dark. The next day, I went to return the cabin key to the rental office in town. It was a small place run by an older man. I handed him the key and said I was leaving early. He looked surprised, asked if everything had been all right. I told him the place was fine, just that the weather was worse than I expected. He nodded, but then mentioned something strange. He said I wasn't the first one to cut the trip short. Apparently, a few people who had stayed there before me had also left early, some even refusing to come back for their belongings. I didn't ask why. I just wanted to leave. I drove straight home to London that afternoon. The trip took over 6 hours, and I didn't stop once. For a long time afterward, I tried not to think about that place, but sometimes late at night when I'm walking home and catch a glimpse of someone standing still across the street or near the corner, I get that same feeling, that cold weight in my chest. I've replayed it in my mind hundreds of times, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was someone living out there, someone mentally unwell or homeless, wandering the woods. Maybe it was just some strange coincidence, someone who happened to pass by every night. But deep down, I can still picture her. How still she was, how quiet the air became when she was there. I can still see those footprints pressed deep into the mud, facing straight toward the door. I've never gone back to Cumbria since then. I deleted the cabin listing from my bookmarks, got rid of the photos, and tried to move on. But no matter how much I tell myself it was just a person, something about the way she watched, never moving, never approaching, still keeps me awake some nights. It wasn't just fear. It was the feeling that she wasn't lost at all. She knew exactly where I was, and she wanted me to know that too. It was late October 2016 when I decided to take a short trip to a cabin I'd rented in the northern woods of Minnesota. I was 28 at the time, single, and tired from months of working long shifts at a small auto repair shop. I wanted some quiet, somewhere I could breathe and think clearly without hearing engines or phones or people talking. I found the cabin listing online, a small wooden place near a lake, surrounded by miles of trees. The photos made it look peaceful, with a rough wooden deck and a narrow gravel path leading down to the water. It seemed perfect. The drive took about 5 hours from Duluth. The last stretch was the hardest, thick forest closing in from both sides, the gravel road full of sharp turns and dips. My truck rattled the whole way. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun had already dipped low, throwing orange light through the trees. The place looked smaller in person, like it had been sitting there untouched for decades. The paint was faded, the porch boards gray and slightly warped. There was a small shed about 20 feet behind it, half covered in weeds. I noticed no other houses in sight, just endless trees, dark and quiet. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. It had one main room with a couch, a small table, and a stove in the corner. There was a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a small window facing the trees. I unpacked slowly, set my bag near the bed, and decided to walk down to the lake before it got dark. The trail was soft from fallen pine needles, and the air was sharp with that cold northern smell. Wet soil, bark, and old leaves. When I reached the water, it was still and flat, reflecting the gray sky like glass. The only sound came from the wind brushing through the trees. That first night went fine. I ate canned soup, sat by the window, and watched the forest fade into black. There were no sounds except the creak of the cabin wood and the wind outside. When I went to sleep, I left the lamp on the nightstand on low, just to keep a little light in the room. The next morning, I woke up early, The light coming through the curtains was dim, the sky heavy with clouds. It felt colder than it should have for late October. I made coffee, ate a few crackers, and went outside to look around. The ground was damp from dew, and I saw a few old footprints near the side of the cabin. Faded, like someone had walked through there days ago. Probably from whoever cleaned the place, I thought. Still, they looked odd, wider apart than normal, like the person had been taking long strides. I didn't think much of it at the time. I spent most of the day walking the area, following the dirt paths that stretched out from the cabin. I didn't see anyone or hear any vehicles. It was quiet enough that I could hear my own footsteps crunching on leaves. Around noon, I found an old fence half collapsed in the woods, like it had once surrounded a property line that no longer mattered. The posts were rotting and leaning over, the wire twisted and rusty. I didn't see any houses nearby. When I came back later that afternoon, I noticed something strange. The back door of the cabin, one that led to the small storage room, was open. I was sure I'd closed it earlier. It wasn't wide open, just cracked enough that it moved slightly when the wind pushed it. Inside, everything looked untouched. I told myself the wind must have blown it open. The latch didn't look very strong. I pushed it shut and wedged a small piece of firewood against it, just in case. That night felt different. The wind picked up, and the woods sounded alive. Branches scraping together, dry leaves moving across the ground. I sat inside reading for a while, but my attention kept drifting toward the window. The dark outside looked thicker than usual, like the trees were closing in closer than before. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I kept the lamp on again. Sometime later, I woke up to a sound, a dull, heavy thud against the side of the cabin. First, I thought it was a branch falling. Then it came again, slower this time, more like a deliberate weight pressing against the wall. I stayed still in bed, listening. The cabin creaked a little, then went silent. I waited, eyes on the ceiling, hearing only the faint hum of the wind. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer brushing against the siding. I rolled over and forced myself back to sleep. In the morning, I went outside to check. The dirt near the cabin wall looked disturbed. The soil was soft from last night's rain, and I could see faint impressions, like prints, but not clear enough to tell what they were. They weren't shaped like boots, though, and they were spaced unevenly. It looked like someone had dragged something heavy or walked oddly. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The day passed quietly again, though I felt uneasy. Every small sound seemed louder. The groan of wood, the wind moving through the branches. Around dusk, I went out to the shed to look for firewood. Inside, I found a stack of old tools, a rusted saw, and a few empty gas cans. It smelled like old oil. I gathered what I needed and went back inside before dark. That night, the noises returned. Not just one or two, but a series of soft movements around the cabin, slow steps, faint scraping. My first instinct was that it was an animal again, maybe raccoons, but these sounds were heavier, more careful, like someone trying not to be heard. My chest tightened as I sat still on the couch, the oil lamp flickering beside me. The steps moved along the porch, then toward the side window. I didn't move. The glass was fogged slightly from the warm air inside, and for a moment I thought I saw a faint outline against it, just the shape of something standing close enough to blur the light. I stayed awake the rest of the night. The sounds faded sometime near dawn. When the sun came up, I packed most of my stuff. I told myself I'd leave that evening, maybe after one last walk. I didn't want to look paranoid, but something didn't feel right. I walked around the cabin again, checking the dirt near the walls. This time I saw clearer impressions.
Bare footprints.
The ground was cold and wet, yet they looked fresh, pressed deep into the mud that trailed from the side of the shed toward the back door. They weren't large, maybe average-sized, but they were uneven, like whoever made them had walked with a limp or on uneven ground. My stomach turned. I went to the back door. The piece of firewood I'd wedged there was gone. The door was shut now, latched properly from the outside. That detail made my skin crawl because I'd been inside all night. I waited until mid-afternoon, then loaded my bag and gear into the truck. I didn't want to stay another night. Before leaving, I walked once more toward the lake. The path looked the same as before, quiet and empty, though I noticed something new. A faint trail of disturbed soil leading away from the cabin toward the deeper woods. The marks disappeared a few feet in, swallowed by pine needles. I didn't follow them. When I finally started the truck, I felt a strange relief hearing the engine. As I backed up, I glanced once more at the cabin. From that distance, it looked small and harmless again, like it couldn't hold anything dangerous. But as I turned onto the narrow road and looked in the rearview mirror, I caught sight of something. Just a dark figure standing near the shed, half hidden behind the trees, still and silent. It wasn't moving, and it wasn't close enough for me to see details. I didn't stop to look longer. I drove until I hit the main road, and I didn't pull over until I reached a gas station 30 miles away. My hands shook the whole time I filled the tank. I didn't go back for the deposit or the rest of my things. Later, I called the rental company to tell them something strange had happened, that maybe someone was trespassing on the property. They said they'd send someone to check. A week later, I got a short email saying the property manager found the cabin fine, though he mentioned that the shed door was torn off its hinges when he arrived, like someone had forced it from the inside. I didn't reply. I just closed the email and never looked at the photos I'd taken of the place. Even now, when I think back to that week, what sticks with me most isn't what I saw, but what I felt. The way the woods seemed to listen, the way the cabin walls felt too thin, like something could be standing just outside, close enough to hear me breathe. I haven't gone camping since. I sold the truck a few months later, and every time I drive through a wooded area, I keep my eyes on the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing just far enough away to almost blend in, watching. It was late October of 1996 when I decided to spend a weekend at my uncle's old farm cabin in northern Arkansas. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, and back then it had always felt peaceful, the kind of quiet you could only find miles away from the nearest paved road. My uncle had passed a few years back, and no one in the family had really touched the place since. I wanted some time alone, away from the city and the noise. It seemed like the perfect spot. The drive took nearly 6 hours, most of it through empty back roads lined with dead cornfields and rotting fences. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the hills. The air had that heavy, cold feeling that comes right before the first frost of the season. The farm looked forgotten. The main barn was leaning slightly, its roof rusted through in places. The fields were dry and overgrown, and the old wooden fence around the cabin had collapsed in 2 corners. The cabin itself sat at the edge of a small patch of woods. The windows were streaked with grime, and the porch sagged in the middle. When I opened the door, the smell hit first: stale wood, dust, and something faintly sour, like damp fabric that had never fully dried. Inside, the air was thick and still. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. The furniture hadn't been moved in years. The kitchen table had an old coffee cup on it, fossilized with brown stains. I unpacked a few things: a flashlight, a sleeping bag, some canned food, a lantern, and a small radio. There was no electricity anymore. The lines had probably been cut years ago. I lit the lantern and walked through each room just to get a feel of the place again. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and every sound echoed faintly through the cabin. The back room was the strangest. I remembered it used to be a storage space for tools, but now it looked like someone had been using it for something else. The walls were scratched, like someone had been dragging metal or wood against them. There were old feed sacks piled in the corner, but underneath them, I could see marks on the floor, dark stains that had soaked deep into the wood. I told myself it was probably oil or old water damage. Still, I didn't like how it looked. That first night, I barely slept. The wind kept brushing against the cabin walls, and every small sound made me tense up. Around midnight, I heard something moving outside. It wasn't the wind, it was too heavy for that. It sounded like slow steps on the dirt, moving around the cabin. I turned off the lantern and sat still, listening. The footsteps stopped after a minute or two, but I could still hear faint crunching sounds near the barn. Maybe an animal, I thought. The place had been abandoned for years. Raccoons or coyotes would have made it their territory by now. In the morning, I went outside to look. The ground was damp from a light rain, and I noticed tracks in the mud. They weren't animal prints, they were boots, old worn soles. They led from the edge of the barn to the side of the cabin and then disappeared near the woods. The prints weren't mine. I hadn't walked there the previous night. I told myself maybe it was a hunter, someone who had wandered too close. Still, I felt uneasy. I decided to keep my hunting knife on me, just in case. The rest of the day was quiet. I spent some time chopping wood for a small fire and tried to fix one of the broken window latches. Around evening, I walked out toward the barn to take a look inside. The large wooden doors were half rotted, but I managed to pry them open. The smell inside was strong mold, rust, and old hay. Dust motes floated in the beam of my flashlight. There were old farming tools hanging on the wall, some still sharp, others rusted to the point of breaking. Toward the back, there was a tarp-covered shape. It looked like some kind of equipment, but when I pulled the tarp back, I found an old metal drum. The lid was sealed shut with wire. It looked too clean, too out of place compared to everything else around it. Something about that bothered me. The rest of the barn looked untouched for years, but the drum had no dust on it. I tried to lift it. It was heavy, maybe half full of something. I didn't open it. I didn't want to. I pushed it back where it was and covered it again. That night was worse. I woke up sometime past 2 a.m. to the sound of something hitting the cabin wall. A dull, solid thump. Then another. I sat up, listening, holding my flashlight. The thumps came again. 2, then 3. Like someone was striking the side of the cabin with a piece of wood. I stayed still for what felt like forever. Eventually, it stopped. When I finally got the courage to check outside, there was nothing. Just the cold wind and silence. By morning, I found new footprints in the dirt again. This time, they were closer, circling the cabin. I felt a tightness in my chest. Whoever it was, they'd been right outside while I was inside, maybe even looking through the windows. I wanted to leave right then, but my truck battery was nearly dead. I hadn't expected the cold to drain it that fast. I decided to give it a few hours and try again after letting it charge from the small jumper pack I'd brought. The day dragged on slowly. Every sound felt amplified. The creak of the porch, the rustle of dry leaves, the wind brushing against the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around dusk, I noticed something strange near the tree line. A thin column of smoke. It was faint, rising from the woods maybe a few hundred yards away. It wasn't from me, and there were no houses for miles in that direction. By nightfall, the smoke was gone. I decided not to sleep. I kept the lantern low, sitting near the window, listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again. This time clearer, slower, moving around the cabin in a circle. Then they stopped near the porch. I could hear the faint sound of wood creaking under weight, like someone stepping onto it. I gripped the handle of my knife and waited. After a few seconds, I heard a slow, dragging sound, like metal scraping over wood. I didn't move. My heart was beating so hard it made my ears ring. I stayed frozen for nearly an hour before the sound faded away. When the sun came up, I went outside. The porch had deep scratch marks along the railing. Some looked fresh. In the dirt below, there was something half-buried. A small metal hook, the kind used for hanging tools. It had a bit of dried mud on it, maybe blood, I couldn't tell. That was enough for me. I packed everything fast and went straight to the truck. The jumper had just enough charge to start it. I didn't look back at the cabin as I pulled out. I drove until I hit the main road, and even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror like I expected someone to be following. A week later, I got a call from the county sheriff. I'd mentioned what I saw when I stopped for gas after leaving. He told me they'd gone to check the place out. The barn had been burned down, he said. No sign of who did it, but they found something strange in the ashes. Several metal drums, all sealed, all empty. He didn't say much else. I never went back there again. The land was sold a few years later and cleared for soy crops. The cabin's gone now, the woods thinned out, nothing left but open fields. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about those boot prints circling the cabin and the sound of something heavy dragging across the porch. The kind of sound you can't ever unhear once you've heard it in the dark. It was early November of 2018 when I decided to take a break from everything and spend a few quiet days at a small rented cabin in northern Arizona, near the edge of Coconino National Forest. I was 28 at the time, tired from work, from the noise of the city, and from a breakup that had left me restless for months. I wanted somewhere silent, somewhere the air felt real again. The listing said it was an off-grid cabin, about 6 miles from the nearest paved road. That kind of isolation appealed to me. I packed food for a week, my camera, a flashlight, and a small rifle that I used mostly for target practice. The drive there was long and slow, the kind that makes you realize how far away you've gone from everything familiar. By the time I reached the dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was already sliding down behind the tall pines. The road was narrow, full of rocks and small dips that made the car shake. The trees on both sides were thick, their shadows merging into a dark wall. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the last bit of sunlight was dying out. It was a small wooden cabin with a slanted tin roof, a front porch, and one window on each side. The walls looked weathered, the color faded into a dull gray. Behind it, the forest stretched endlessly, tall and heavy with silence. I remember stepping out of the car, breathing in the cold air, and thinking how good it felt to finally hear nothing but the sound of the wind moving through the trees. Inside, the cabin was simple. Just a table, a single bed, a small stove, and a few old shelves. There was no electricity, no phone signal, and no running water except for a hand pump near the back. I liked it immediately. I set my stuff down, lit a few candles, and heated a can of soup on the stove. By the time I finished eating, it was completely dark outside. That first night was quiet, but not peaceful. There was a strange tension in the air. I lay in bed, listening to the faint sounds outside. The creak of wood, the wind brushing past the cabin walls, and something else that I couldn't quite place. It sounded almost like soft footsteps somewhere in the distance. I told myself it was probably an animal. There were plenty of coyotes in that area, maybe even elk. I pushed it out of my mind and forced myself to sleep. The next morning was calm and bright. I made coffee on the stove and took a walk around the clearing. There were tracks in the dirt road leading away from the cabin, thin and long, not quite human, but not like any animal I recognized either. They looked like someone had walked barefoot, but the shape was off. I crouched down to look closer, thinking it was just an odd shadow or distortion from the dirt, but the prints were clear. The toes were long, stretched out unnaturally, and the heel marks seemed deeper, like whoever made them was heavier than a normal person. I felt uneasy but shrugged it off. Maybe a local hiker had passed by the day before. I spent the rest of that day chopping some wood, taking photos, and sitting on the porch reading. Felt good for a while, calm, almost healing. But as the sun began to set again, that same uneasy feeling returned. When night fell, I lit a lantern and stayed inside. Around midnight, I heard the same noise again, those slow, dragging footsteps somewhere near the treeline. This time they were closer. I froze, listening. They would move a few steps, then stop for several seconds, then move again. I turned off the lantern to see through the window, but all I could make out was the black shape of trees swaying in the wind. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded away. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside to check the area around the cabin. In the mud near the pump, I found new footprints, the same strange long ones as before. But these ones were clearer, fresher. They led from the woods toward the cabin, then stopped a few feet from the porch, as if whoever or whatever it was had stood there watching. That day, I couldn't focus on anything. Every sound outside made me look up. I kept my rifle close, though I didn't really think I'd need it. I told myself it was probably just some animal deformity or even a prank. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By the third night, I was exhausted but too anxious to sleep. The wind outside had picked up, making the trees groan and creak. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the footsteps, this time circling the cabin slowly. The steps were heavy but uneven, like someone dragging one leg. I sat up in bed, staring at the dark window, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The sound stopped directly outside the wall near the window. I didn't move. I could hear breathing, slow, steady breathing, deep enough to be human. It went on for several seconds, then faded. I didn't hear it walk away. I sat there in the dark until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When I finally stepped outside, the ground was covered in those same footprints again, circling the entire cabin. But something about them was different. They seemed to change shape halfway through the pattern. Some looked like normal barefoot prints, and then they stretched and twisted as if the person's feet had bent mid-step. It made no sense. By then, I was scared enough to think about leaving early. I packed my things but told myself I'd stay one more night, just to see if I was overreacting. The day went by quietly. I kept busy stacking wood, checking my car, and staying near the cabin. But the forest felt wrong. Even the birds were silent. When night came, I kept the lantern burning and sat on the bed with my rifle across my lap. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time it wasn't just footsteps. It was something moving quickly between the trees, fast and low, too fast to be human. I caught glimpses of it in the dark, just faint flashes of movement, like a body crawling or running awkwardly on all fours. Stopped near the treeline, and I saw it just for a second. It looked like a man, but thin, pale, and bent wrong, his limbs too long, his body shifting slightly in the light like his skin didn't fit right. He stood there, still as stone, watching the cabin. Then he turned and vanished into the woods. That was it for me. I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed my bag, threw everything into the car, and left. The drive back down that dirt road was the longest of my life. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see something following me through the trees. When I finally reached the highway, the relief was almost overwhelming. I didn't stop until I reached a small town and pulled into a gas station. I sat there in the car, staring at my shaking hands, trying to make sense of what had happened. A few days later, when I mentioned it to the guy who rented me the cabin over email, he didn't sound surprised. He just said people around that area sometimes reported seeing things they shouldn't look too hard at. He said it was best not to go wandering after dark in those woods. I never went back. Even now, years later, I still think about those prints, about that thing watching me from the trees. Sometimes when I'm driving at night and see the dark line of forest off the road, I remember that pale figure standing there in silence, and I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was a man, maybe something else entirely. But I know what I saw was real, and I know I was being watched that night. I'll never forget how quiet the woods were, how the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to leave. And I did. I left and never looked back. It was late October of 2014 when I drove up to the hunting cabin my uncle left behind after he passed away. The cabin sat deep in the northern woods of Montana, about an hour off the nearest paved road. I had gone there before with him when I was younger, but that had been years ago. Back then, it felt peaceful. Quiet pine forests, cold air that carried the smell of dirt and wood smoke. But going there alone as an adult felt different. The silence didn't feel peaceful anymore, felt heavy. The trip was supposed to be simple. A weekend hunting trip, just me, a rifle, and my dog, Max. I needed time away from everything. Work, noise, people. The cabin had no phone signal, no electricity except for an old generator, and no neighbors for miles. It was the kind of place you either enjoyed or went crazy in. The dirt road leading to it was rough, uneven, covered in dried leaves and branches. I could hear them crunch under the tires as the woods grew thicker around me. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt that strange mix of comfort and unease. It looked the same as I remembered. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, a small chimney leaning slightly. The old tin roof had rust spots that matched the color of the soil. There was a single window facing the front and another smaller one in the back. I parked the truck near a pile of chopped wood that had turned gray from age. Max jumped out first, sniffing around the edges of the porch. The air smelled damp and cold, like wet bark. I unlocked the cabin and pushed the door open. Stuck a little at the bottom. Inside, it smelled like dust, oil, and something faintly sour, like old fabric that hadn't seen fresh air in years. There were a few things left behind. An old cot, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a rack of rusty tools hanging by the door, and a hunting calendar from 2008 still tacked to the wall. I dropped my gear and walked through the place, brushing away cobwebs and checking the back door, which had swollen from years of moisture. It didn't close right. The first night, I didn't sleep much. The wind scraped against the roof and made the trees outside creak. Every small sound carried inside. The drip of water from the eaves, the scurry of something small under the floorboards, Max shifting in his sleep beside the door. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the woods. I'd been in worse conditions before. In the morning, I made coffee on the small propane stove and stepped outside. The ground was covered with frost, and mist hung low between the trees. I walked around a bit, getting a feel for the land again. About 50 yards from the cabin, there was an old deer blind nailed between 2 trees. I remembered my uncle building it. I climbed up to look around. The woods were silent, except for the distant sound of running water from a creek nearby. That day, I didn't see much, a few tracks, maybe a fox. I set some bait in a clearing not far from the cabin and headed back as the light started to fade. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped sharply. The generator coughed to life after a few tries, lighting the small cabin with a single dim bulb. I made dinner, fed Max, and tried to relax. That's when I noticed something odd. The front door latch, the small metal hook that kept it closed, was bent outward. Not broken, just slightly pulled, like someone had forced it open. I stared at it for a while, trying to remember if I'd done it myself. I didn't think I had. The wood around it was splintered too, but not fresh. Still, it made me uneasy. That night, I set a chair under the door handle just in case. Max seemed restless. He kept pacing near the door, his ears twitching at every sound outside. Around midnight, I heard what I thought was someone walking in the yard. Just a few slow steps, crunching over the frosty ground. I held my breath, waiting for it to happen again, but it didn't. When I finally looked out the window, there was nothing, just trees and my truck sitting in the dark. The next morning, I went outside to check the ground. There were faint prints leading around the side of the cabin, too large for an animal. They weren't clear enough to tell what kind of boots they were, but they were deep. Someone had been walking there during the night. The tracks came from the direction of the tree line and stopped behind the cabin, near the window that looked into the small bedroom. I spent most of the day pretending it didn't bother me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I packed up some of my stuff, planning to leave the next morning, but something in me wanted to stay one more night, maybe to prove to myself that I wasn't being paranoid. That evening, I shut everything tight. I moved the truck closer to the porch and kept the rifle beside me. Around 10, the generator sputtered and went out, plunging everything into darkness. I didn't bother restarting it. I sat in the dark, listening. A few hours later, Max started growling low and steady. I could barely see him in the faint light coming through the window. He was staring at the back door, his fur bristled. Then I heard it slow, steady breathing from outside the door. Not close enough to be right against it, but near. It went on for several seconds, then stopped. I waited, not moving, until I heard faint footsteps again, this time circling the cabin. They moved past the side window, then toward the front. I heard the porch boards creak under the weight of someone stepping on them. I aimed the rifle toward the door and waited. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my hands. After a few minutes, nothing. The air felt heavy and still. Max eventually laid back down, though his eyes stayed fixed on the door. I didn't sleep at all. When daylight came, I opened the door slowly and looked around. The frost was gone, replaced by patches of mud. There were prints again, this time clearer. They led from the woods to the porch, then around the cabin to the back, the same spot near the window. They weren't old. I packed everything, loaded the truck, and didn't even bother to eat breakfast. Before leaving, I walked to the edge of the woods to see where the prints went. They followed a faint path that disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring into the dark spaces between the trunks, trying to see if someone was still out there. I didn't see anyone, but I knew whoever it was had been close enough to watch me for hours. On the drive back, I stopped once at a small gas station about 20 miles from the cabin. When I stepped out to fill up, I noticed something on the side of my truck door, a muddy handprint, large, smeared right under the window. It wasn't there when I left that morning. I never went back to that cabin again. A few months later, I heard from a local sheriff that they found signs of an old camp deep in those same woods. A tarp, food cans, and bones from small animals. He said someone had probably been living out there for a while, maybe years. Thinking back, I realized the person wasn't trying to scare me. They were probably just curious or hungry. Maybe they watched the cabin waiting for me to leave. Maybe they wanted what little I had in there. But that thought doesn't make it better. What sticks with me most isn't the sound of the footsteps or the prints. It's knowing that while I was sitting in that cabin, trying to convince myself I was alone, someone had been just outside, watching quietly from the dark. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to spend a few nights in an old wooden cabin near the edge of a graveyard outside a small town called Redfield, somewhere in the countryside of northern England. I was 31 then, working a stressful job in Leeds, and I needed a break from people, noise, and the endless weight of the city pressing on my mind. The cabin wasn't a holiday rental or anything fancy. It was an old property that once belonged to my great-uncle, who used it decades ago as a caretaker's place when the graveyard was still maintained by hand. After his death, nobody had really bothered with it. My family always said the place was too far gone. Too cold, too lonely, too depressing. That's what made it perfect for me. I drove up there in my old gray Vauxhall on a dull Friday afternoon. The sky hung low with thick, unmoving clouds, and the air had that wet chill that sinks into your clothes. The cabin sat behind a line of thin, crooked trees, the kind that looked dead even in summer. The road turned into gravel and then into dirt as I got closer. I parked beside a rusted metal gate that leaned into the weeds, grabbed my backpack, and walked the last bit on foot. The first thing I noticed when I got there was the smell. It wasn't rot exactly, just that heavy, earthy scent of damp wood and soil. The grass around the place reached up to my knees, and the roof was sagging on one side, but the cabin still stood solid enough. I unlocked the warped door and stepped inside. The air was stale, filled with dust and the faint smell of mice. The floorboards creaked with every step. There was one small bed frame with a thin mattress, a wooden table, and a single chair. The walls were dark from years of moisture. I checked for any animal nests or leaks before setting up my sleeping bag. There was a small stone fireplace too, half filled with old ashes. I opened the windows to let in some air and light. Behind the cabin, through a row of birch trees, the graveyard stretched out quietly. The old gravestones leaned in all directions, some nearly swallowed by the grass. There were no new graves there. It hadn't been used for decades, maybe longer. Some of the names were unreadable, worn smooth by weather. I remember standing there for a while, just looking over it. It was still. The wind moved softly through the dry grass, and every now and then I'd hear the faint creak of a branch or the soft flutter of crows in the distance. The first night was fine, cold but fine. I lit a small fire, cooked some beans, and read from an old book I brought. The silence was strange though, not peaceful but too complete. Even the insects seemed quiet. When I went to sleep, I could hear the wind pressing against the walls and the faint rustling of leaves, but nothing else. I woke up once or twice to check my phone for the time, but there was no signal here, just the dark. The second day, I walked around the area. The graveyard went on farther than I thought, bordered by a half-collapsed stone wall. Beyond that was a small pond covered in algae. I found an old shed near the far end, empty except for a few broken tools and a metal bucket. There were animal tracks in the dirt, maybe foxes or badgers. I remember finding something odd though. Near one of the older graves, a square patch of dirt looked freshly disturbed, like someone had been digging there not long ago. The soil was darker and looser than the rest. I thought maybe an animal had been burrowing, but it looked too even for that. I didn't think too much of it then, just made a mental note to avoid walking there in case I stepped into something soft. That night, things felt different. I tried to sleep, but there was a faint sound outside, something like slow footsteps in the grass. I told myself it was just a fox or deer, but the sound stopped right near the cabin. I didn't move, just lay there listening, waiting for it to pass. After a while, I heard the crunch of gravel fade toward the graveyard, and I finally managed to sleep again. The next morning, I saw tracks in the dirt near the door, boot prints. Not animal prints, but actual boots. They were half filled with mud and led toward the trees behind the cabin. My chest tightened a little as I followed them. They went straight toward the graveyard, right up to that same disturbed patch of soil I'd seen the day before. Someone had been digging again during the night. The hole was deeper now, maybe a foot or two down. I didn't touch anything, just stood there staring at it, feeling uneasy. I went back to the cabin and spent most of the day inside. I kept thinking about who would come out here and dig around in an abandoned graveyard. There were no houses nearby, no reason for anyone to be here. I locked the door that night and kept the fire low. I barely slept, listening for any sound outside. Around midnight, I heard movement again. It wasn't fast, it was slow, steady. This time, it wasn't just near the graveyard. Came closer, circling the cabin. The dry leaves crackled underfoot. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then it stopped. I waited for minutes, maybe longer, before hearing it again faintly, moving away. By morning, I was done pretending this was normal. I packed my bag and decided to leave. When I stepped outside, I saw that the footprints were everywhere, around the cabin, near the trees, even by the pond. They weren't fresh anymore, but overlapping, like someone had been walking there again and again during the night. I went to the gate and found it open, though I'd shut it when I arrived. Before I left, I walked one last time toward that grave. The hole was now much deeper, at least waist high. The dirt was thrown around messily, and beside it was a shovel. Not an old one either, a fairly new metal one with a black handle. My stomach turned cold. I looked down into the hole and saw a piece of wood at the bottom, dark, splintered, maybe part of an old coffin. Whoever had been out here was digging up graves. I didn't want to be anywhere near that, so I hurried back to my car. The air smelled strange that morning, heavy with wet soil and something else, something metallic. I kept my eyes on the road as I drove back to the main road, and once I got signal, I called the local police station in Redfield to report what I saw. They said they'd send someone to check it out. 2 days later, I got a call from them. They asked me to come in and confirm what I'd seen. When I did, they told me they found more than one dug-up grave out there. Whoever had been doing it wasn't just looking in one place. They'd been digging all over the far end of the graveyard. Some of the graves were empty. They couldn't say for sure if the remains had been moved or stolen, but it looked deliberate. They also told me something else. A small tent had been found hidden in the trees behind the graveyard, along with clothes, food wrappers, and tools. Someone had been living out there for a while. They never found the person. They searched the nearby woods and farms but came up empty. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about those nights in the cabin. The slow footsteps, the quiet digging sounds, the sense that someone was just outside, watching. Every sound I'd brushed off as wind or animals had probably been him. While I was asleep, someone was out there digging through graves a few yards away. The thought of it still makes my skin crawl. The cabin is still there, as far as I know, but I never went back. They sealed off the graveyard for investigation and put up a metal fence, but it didn't matter. The place was ruined for me. Whenever I think about that weekend, I don't picture the graves or the shovel or the empty silence. What sticks in my mind most clearly is how close the footsteps had been that second night. How they had circled the cabin, just feet from where I was lying, half awake, listening in the dark. And the thing that chills me even now is that I'll never know if the person who dug those graves stopped when I left, or if he's still out there somewhere, waiting for the next quiet place where no one will notice what he's doing in the dirt. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided to make the trip out to the cabin. The place had belonged to my ex-husband, Darren, before he passed away in a car accident the previous winter. I hadn't been back since the divorce, and to be honest, I wasn't sure why I was going. Part of me thought I could confront some leftover anger, maybe even grief, but mostly I just wanted the solitude. I needed to get away from the city, from the buzzing lights and the constant noise that never let me breathe. The cabin itself was in the northern woods of New Hampshire, a good 3-hour drive from my apartment in Manchester. By the time I arrived, it was mid-afternoon, the sun barely cutting through the heavy gray clouds. The gravel road leading up to the cabin was overgrown, potholes filled with rainwater, and fallen branches lay scattered across the path. I parked my old Jeep at the edge of the driveway, stepping out into the crisp air. The wind carried the faint smell of damp leaves and pine, and the silence felt almost suffocating after the city. The cabin hadn't been touched since Darren died. The wood was gray with age, the roof sagging slightly on one side, and the front porch steps creaked under my weight. I paused for a moment, staring at it, feeling a strange mixture of nostalgia and unease. Inside, everything was coated in dust. Cobwebs stretched across corners, and the furniture, sturdy old pine, was draped in thin sheets. Sunlight filtering through the dirt-streaked windows gave the whole room a ghostly golden glow. I set my bag down in the small living room and started the first task, clearing out the remnants of Darren's life. Papers were scattered across the desk, mugs with dried coffee rings still on the table. It was strange, the way his absence made everything feel hollow. I pushed aside a stack of old magazines and ran a broom across the floor. Dust rose into the air in tiny clouds, catching the light as I moved. My dog, a large, shaggy lab named Max, padded silently behind me. He had this way of sensing tension, of knowing when I was on edge, and today he seemed particularly alert, ears twitching at every creak in the cabin. By the time I finished tidying the living room, dusk had begun to settle. The forest outside was thick and dark, shadows pooling between the trees. I decided to light a fire in the small stone fireplace, the first flicker of warmth in the cabin in months. The sound of the matches striking and the crackle of the wood gave the place a sense of life, but the shadows seemed to lean closer to the walls as if they were watching. As the fire grew, I moved to the kitchen to make something simple to eat. The stove worked, but the cupboards were nearly empty except for a few cans of beans and some old pasta. I boiled water, stirred beans in a pot, and tried to shake off the unease gnawing at me. Max lay at my feet, tail occasionally thumping against the floorboards. That's when I noticed it, the first faint sound that didn't belong. A tapping, like someone running a finger along the window outside. I froze, straining to hear over the hiss of the boiling water. It stopped. I shook my head, probably a branch brushing against the glass. After dinner, I cleaned up and settled into one of the bedrooms upstairs. The bed was covered in a thick quilt, moth-eaten but still serviceable. I opened the window slightly to let in the night air. The forest was alive with noises. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Max shifted uneasily beside the bed. The tapping returned, this time softer, more deliberate, echoing through the darkened room. I didn't dare get up. I pulled the quilt tighter around myself, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Hours passed. The fire in the fireplace had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Max's low growl broke the silence, making my heart jump. I couldn't see anything outside the window, but the sense of being watched pressed against my skin. That's when I heard it, a slow, dragging sound coming from the porch. Someone or something was moving out there. My chest tightened. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon, but then the dragging stopped just below the window. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the porch. Nothing, just shadows, the rotting wood, and a pile of leaves moved by the wind. I told myself it was nothing, yet the air in the room felt heavier, the darkness almost solid. Max stood, hackles raised, growling low and steady. That's when the window rattled. A knock, sharp and deliberate. My stomach sank. I had no idea who could be out there. Darren had no family close by, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. The thought of someone just standing outside my window made my skin crawl. I grabbed my phone, only to find there was no signal. Panic started to rise, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered the old rifle Darren had in the corner of the living room. I crept downstairs, careful to step lightly on the creaking floorboards. The rifle was heavy in my hands, the cold metal reassuring. I checked the chamber, it was loaded. The dragging sound had stopped. The porch was empty. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Footprints in the wet leaves, large, human, circling the cabin slowly, as if testing the perimeter. I swallowed hard. Whoever it was knew the cabin well. Whoever it was had patience. I stayed up all night, moving quietly from window to window, watching the shadows and listening. Max refused to leave my side, growling at every sound. As dawn finally broke, I saw no one, and the forest seemed to return to its normal rhythm. Exhausted, I fell into a shallow sleep, rifle by my side. When I woke, sunlight streamed through the windows. The footprints were still there, now hardened in the frosty leaves. I didn't wait to investigate further. I packed my things, Max's leash tight in my hand, and drove away without looking back. The whole trip felt surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't shake. A week later, I found out through the local police that a man had been arrested for breaking into cabins in the area. He had a long record for theft and stalking, and it turned out the cabin had been on his list for months. I realized then how lucky I had been to be alert and cautious. Had I ignored the signs, I could have ended up trapped, isolated, and alone in the dark with someone dangerous. Since that trip, I've never returned to that part of New Hampshire. I sold the cabin, never looked at it again. But Max still flinches whenever he hears a knock at the door. And sometimes, when the wind rattles the windows, I remember that night. I remember the quiet dragging, the shadows, the feeling of being watched, and I shiver. It was real. There were no ghosts, no fairy tales. Just a cabin, an empty forest, and someone willing to take advantage of my solitude. Now I stick to well-lit streets, familiar places, and I never, ever ignore the instinct that tells me something is wrong. That night taught me the most basic, terrifying truth. The world can be dangerous even in the quietest places, and sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see coming. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to spend a week alone at a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. I was 32 at the time, burned out from work, tired of traffic, tired of my phone, and tired of people. The cabin belonged to a distant friend of my cousin, an old hunting retreat sitting near a quiet lake, a few miles from the nearest paved road. It sounded like exactly what I needed: quiet, isolation, a chance to breathe. The drive there took nearly 9 hours from where I lived. The last 2 were nothing but gravel and dirt roads, twisting through thick trees that grew taller the farther I went. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and damp soil. I remember rolling down the window just to feel it, even though the wind kicked dust into my car. My GPS stopped working long before I reached the place, and I relied on printed directions that were starting to crumple from the steering wheel's pressure. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low, coloring the sky with a deep orange light. The building stood in a small clearing, a single-story wooden structure with a porch and 2 rocking chairs covered in a thin layer of dust. The lake sat just behind it, silent and still, reflecting the sky like glass. There was an old metal rowboat tied to a half-rotted dock. Everything looked untouched for years. Inside, the cabin was simple: wood floors, a stone fireplace, an old sofa that smelled faintly of mildew, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed. The kitchen had a small fridge, a gas stove, and a wooden table with 1 chair. The air inside was cool, stale, and faintly earthy, like it hadn't been opened up in a long time. I unpacked my few things, checked the locks on the doors and windows, and set up a small lantern on the table. The first day passed quietly. I walked around the lake, took some photos, cooked a simple meal, and read a book until the light faded. I went to bed early, feeling calm for the first time in months. The quiet was heavy, but peaceful. I could hear the faint creaking of wood as the cabin cooled, and the distant chirping of crickets. On the second night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunching of leaves, slow and steady. At first, I thought it might be a deer, I stayed still, listening. The steps stopped, then started again, moving closer to the cabin. I didn't have curtains on the window, and the moonlight spilled faintly through the glass. I couldn't see much, just the outline of trees swaying. After a while, the noise faded away. I convinced myself it was an animal and went back to sleep, though it took a while. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. I found footprints in the dirt near the porch steps. Not animal prints, boots. They led from the trees to the porch and back again. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. They looked fresh, maybe from the night before. The idea of someone being out here unsettled me. The nearest neighbor was supposed to be more than 5 miles away. I tried to shake it off. There could have been hunters or hikers passing through. I told myself that. Still, that day I kept my pocket knife in reach, and every time the wind rustled the trees, I found myself glancing out the window. By the 4th night, I was struggling to sleep. Every small sound made me alert. The creak of the wood, the soft whine of the wind through the cracks. Around midnight, I decided to get some air. The moon was bright, washing the clearing in pale light. The lake was still, and the forest around it looked endless. I stood on the porch for a few minutes, just listening. Then I heard something, a faint metallic sound, like a chain or metal hook tapping against something, came from near the dock. I walked a few steps closer, careful not to make much noise. The sound stopped. I could see the old boat tied to the dock, swaying slightly though the water was calm. Nothing else. I stood there a moment longer, then went back inside and locked the door. That night, I barely slept at all. My mind wouldn't quiet down. I kept replaying the sound, the footprints, the silence that seemed too deep. When morning came, I packed a small bag and decided to drive into town for a bit. It was a long drive, over an hour, but I needed to see other people, even for a short time. When I returned that evening, I noticed something that froze me. The chair on the porch, the one I hadn't touched, was turned slightly toward the woods. I was sure it had been facing the lake before. I stood in the driveway, staring at it for a long time. Maybe the wind had done it, I thought. But the chair was heavy, thick wood. It would have taken effort to move. That night, I kept every light in the cabin on. I stayed sitting in the main room, not reading, not doing anything, just listening. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps moving slow around the cabin. I didn't move, just sat there with my heart pounding so hard it felt like the sound would give me away. The steps circled to the back, paused near the window, then faded away into the woods. When morning came, I checked the ground again. More footprints, this time closer, right below the window where I had been sitting. I was done. I started packing immediately. I didn't care that it was early or that I had paid for a full week. I needed to leave. As I loaded my bag into the car, I saw something near the treeline, a small pile of stones stacked neatly, almost like a marker. I hadn't noticed it before. There was something unsettling about how deliberate it looked, as if someone had made it recently. I didn't go closer. The road out felt longer than before. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, my eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror. Every mile of forest seemed endless. Every turn just another reminder of how far I was from anyone. When I finally reached the main road and cell service came back, I pulled over and sat there for a while, breathing hard. Later, after I got home, I told a friend about the footprints and the noises. He said the area around that lake had a reputation for being used by illegal trappers and people who camped off-grid to stay hidden. Sometimes, he said, they watched cabins, waiting to see if anyone was alone. I didn't ask more. I didn't want to know. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me, and I searched for that area online. I found a few old forum posts from hunters talking about strangers living out there. Someone who supposedly built makeshift shelters in the woods and avoided being seen. No name, no details, just warnings not to camp near the lake. That was enough for me. I deleted the photos I'd taken, even the pretty ones of the lake. I didn't want to see them again. Sometimes, though, when I can't sleep, I still think about that sound outside the window. The slow steps circling the cabin, the way they paused, just once, right below where I sat. I wonder how long whoever it was had been watching before I noticed. And every time I do, I feel that same heavy stillness again. The quiet that isn't peaceful anymore. The kind that feels like something is waiting just beyond the trees. It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to take a few weeks off from everything and head out to the countryside. I had been working construction for almost a decade straight, barely taking any real break, and my body was beginning to feel it. My cousin owned a small piece of land about 20 miles out of Helena, Montana, where there was nothing but rolling hills, old barns, and long stretches of gravel roads that looked like they hadn't seen a car in months. He had built a tiny wooden cabin there years ago, mainly for hunting season, but he told me I could use it anytime. I thought it would be the perfect place to clear my head, get some quiet, and just be away from people for a while. The cabin was simple. One room with a small bathroom and a porch that looked out over a wide valley filled with tall grass and wildflowers. There was no cell service, no internet, and the nearest neighbor was maybe 5 miles down the dirt road. I brought my dog, Max, a 3-year-old German Shepherd who had always been protective and calm, never the kind to bark at nothing. He was my company, and I figured he'd help keep me grounded out there. The first few days went by quietly. I spent my time chopping wood, cooking simple meals on the old gas stove, walking the trails around the property, and watching the sunset from the porch every evening. The quiet felt strange at first, like my ears were trying to find something to listen to, but after a while, it became peaceful. Max liked to roam around near the tree line, sometimes chasing rabbits but never wandering too far. Everything felt calm, too calm, maybe, but it was a kind of calm I thought I needed. On the 4th night, I noticed something odd. I had gone out to stack more firewood behind the cabin when I saw tire tracks on the dirt road. They were fresh. The mud had dried unevenly, and you could still see where the tread pattern pressed into the soft ground. I hadn't heard any vehicles pass by all day. The only road out here led past my cabin and dead-ended at a dried-up creek bed about a mile away. There was no reason for anyone to come this far unless they knew I was here, or they were lost. I brushed it off that night, telling myself maybe a rancher or hunter had taken a wrong turn. Still, I found myself checking the windows before I went to bed. Max seemed fine, lying by the door, breathing steady and calm. I remember thinking that if something really was off, he'd sense it before I ever did. The next morning, I went out to where the tire tracks were. I followed them down the road a bit, maybe 100 yards, and saw that they stopped suddenly, like whoever had driven out here had turned around right there in the middle of the road. The odd thing was, the ground was uneven, and it would have taken some effort to make that tight of a turn. It didn't make much sense, but I didn't think too much of it. I spent the rest of the day clearing out the overgrown grass near the porch and fixing one of the shutters that had come loose. That night, Max woke me up. It was around 2 a.m. I heard him growl low and deep, the kind of growl he never made unless something really bothered him. He was standing by the front door, staring at it. The cabin was completely dark except for the faint moonlight coming through the window. I stayed still for a moment, trying to listen. At first, all I could hear was the wind moving through the grass outside. Then, faintly, I heard it, footsteps. Slow, steady, crunching on gravel. They weren't close, but they were there. The kind of sound that makes your stomach twist a little. I quietly reached for the small flashlight on the table beside the bed. When I turned it on, Max's ears perked up, and his growl turned into a quiet whine, like he was unsure. I stood up and moved to the window, keeping the light off now. I could barely see past the porch, but I thought I caught a glimpse of movement down near the road. Something dark, moving low to the ground, then still again. I waited there for what felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. Eventually, the sound faded and Max calmed down. I didn't go back to sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I went outside and checked around the cabin. About 30 feet from the porch, I saw footprints in the dirt. They were faint but visible enough, boot prints, adult size, deep in some spots like the person had been standing there for a while. They led toward the cabin but stopped halfway, right where the grass started. Whoever it was, they had come close enough to see the cabin but not close enough to reach the porch. I spent that day uneasy. I didn't feel like doing anything. I kept Max close and stayed near the cabin. I checked the old rifle that my cousin kept there. It was dusty but still loaded. I didn't want to use it, but just knowing it was there made me feel a little better. The following night, I left one of the lanterns burning low by the window. I wanted to see if it would draw whoever or whatever was out there. Around midnight, Max started pacing again. I heard it too this time. A truck engine, far away but steady. The sound came closer, then cut off suddenly. I stepped onto the porch, keeping the lantern behind me so I could see out into the dark. The night was dead quiet. Then I heard a car door open. My heart was pounding. The sound came from somewhere near the bend in the road. I couldn't see headlights, but I could smell something faint. Gasoline mixed with the metallic scent of hot engine. Then silence again. I stood there for several minutes, not moving. Finally, I went back inside, locked the door, and kept the rifle beside me. I didn't sleep at all. Around 4 a.m., I heard the engine start again and fade into the distance. When the first bit of daylight came, I went out and checked the road. There were more tire tracks now, stopping near the same place as before. But this time I found something else. A crushed cigarette butt, still slightly damp from the dew, and a small torn piece of fabric caught on a barbed wire fence post. It looked like part of a dark jacket. That was enough for me. I packed my stuff that morning. I didn't even bother to make breakfast. I loaded everything into my truck, called Max into the passenger seat, and drove straight out of there. On the way down the road, I passed the spot where the tracks turned around and noticed something I hadn't before. Old bullet casings scattered near the edge of the ditch, like someone had used that place for target practice, or worse. When I finally got back into town, I stopped at a small gas station and told the owner about the tire tracks and the footprints. He looked at me and said a few weeks back there'd been reports of break-ins at some of the ranch houses outside of town, mostly places that looked empty. One of them had ended badly when the owner came home early. I never went back to that cabin after that. My cousin sold the property a year later. He said someone offered him a good price for it, and I didn't ask who. I still think about those nights sometimes. The footsteps, the quiet engine, the feeling of being watched from just beyond the dark. What stuck with me most was how ordinary it all was. No ghosts, no strange lights, just the kind of danger that hides in the empty places people forget about. Places where help is hours away and nobody hears you if something goes wrong. Sometimes, when I take Max out for a walk at night and the wind hits just right, I swear I can still hear that faint sound of gravel under slow, careful footsteps. It was late October 2013 when I decided to take a week off and head out to the mountains in northern Idaho. I'd been working too many hours at the mill, and my head was starting to feel like it was packed with sawdust. I just needed some quiet. I brought my dog, Ranger, a big tan German Shepherd who had more sense than most people I knew. I rented an old hunting cabin that sat a few miles off a narrow dirt road, tucked deep in the woods near Priest Lake. It was supposed to be peaceful. It was supposed to clear my mind, but it didn't go that way. The cabin was small, 2 rooms with a stove, an old iron bed, and a single oil lamp that hung crooked on a nail beside the window. The wood was dark and dry, The floor creaked in every spot, and the smell of smoke and pine needles hung thick inside. I parked my truck a few feet from the porch, unloaded my bags, and let Ranger sniff around. The air was damp, the kind that made sound travel strange. Every snap of a twig seemed louder than it should have been. I figured it was just my nerves adjusting to the quiet after months of noise. The first night was calm. I built a small fire outside, heated a can of beans on the stove, and sat with Ranger by my feet. The woods were still except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the sound of something moving far off. I wasn't uneasy, not yet. When I went inside later, Ranger stayed alert, ears twitching at every sound. Around midnight, I woke up to him pacing near the door. I could hear rain starting to fall against the roof, light at first, then steady. I got up, checked the latch, and told him to settle down. He didn't, not for a while. I lay there listening to his nails click on the floor until he finally curled up and slept. The next morning, I noticed tracks in the mud near the truck. Not boot tracks, more like bare feet. Small, but deep enough to show the heel and toes clearly. They led from the edge of the tree line up toward the cabin and then back again. I crouched down and looked closer. They weren't there the night before, and the rain hadn't washed them out completely, so they had to be fresh. It was strange, but I told myself it was probably kids from one of the nearby campsites messing around. Still, there were no camps within a mile. I spent the day cutting small firewood and checking the roof for leaks. The woods felt heavier that day, like everything was watching. Even Ranger was jumpier. He'd stop suddenly while walking, stare into the trees, and growl low under his breath. I couldn't see or hear anything, but the feeling stuck with me. By late afternoon, a fog started to drift in, thick enough to blur the trees. I decided to call it a day and stay close to the cabin. That night, I sat by the fire inside, reading an old hunting magazine that someone had left behind. The wind had picked up, whistling through the cracks in the walls. The fire snapped, and I could hear rain hitting the window. Ranger was by the door again, his head low but eyes fixed outside. Then I heard it, a slow crunching sound, like someone walking in the wet gravel outside. Stopped, started again, then stopped. I froze. Ranger let out a quiet growl. I turned off the lamp so the light wouldn't show through the window and waited. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. I could hear them near the porch, then behind the cabin, then silence. My hand was shaking a little as I grabbed the flashlight and my knife. I waited for several minutes before turning the light on and stepping out. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The ground was soft. The first thing I saw was more footprints, bare just like before, but now closer, almost right up to the door. They were smaller than mine but spaced out, like whoever made them was walking quickly. The fog made it hard to see more than 10 feet ahead. I walked the perimeter with Ranger close behind, his fur standing up. I didn't see anyone, just the trees bending in the wind and the faint sound of water dripping from the branches. When I got back inside, I bolted the door and pushed the small table in front of it. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me sit up and listen. By morning, I decided I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin the trip. I made coffee, fed Ranger, and planned to hike a bit around the lake. The fog had lifted, and sunlight pushed through the trees, making the woods look normal again. I almost convinced myself that maybe I'd heard a deer or maybe even a bear the night before. But then, when I walked behind the cabin, I found something that changed that thought. Near the back wall, half hidden under the ferns, there was a torn piece of fabric, dark red, like an old flannel shirt. It was damp and ripped along the edges with what looked like dried mud or maybe blood on it. It wasn't new, but it hadn't been there the day before. I stood there holding it, feeling that same heavy quiet pressing down again. I tossed it into the fire pit, watched it curl and blacken in the flames, and decided to cut my trip short. I packed most of my things by late afternoon, but I wanted to stay one more night just to make sure I wasn't overreacting. I didn't want to tell people back home I'd left early because I got spooked by noises and footprints, so I stayed. That final night was worse than the others. The rain came down harder, and the wind felt like it was pushing against the cabin walls. Ranger was restless again, pacing, whining low, his eyes darting toward the door. Around midnight, there was another sound, something brushing against the outside wall, then a dull thump, like a hand or fist hitting the wood. I froze, listening. The sound came again, slower this time. Ranger barked once, loud and sharp, and whatever was outside moved fast toward the back of the cabin. I could hear branches snapping and leaves rustling. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lamp off and sat by the window until dawn. When the light came through, I opened the door slowly and stepped out. The ground was a mess of footprints again, circling the cabin in no clear pattern. Some looked fresh, others half-washed by the rain. They went off toward the trees and disappeared into the mud. I followed them for a while, just enough to see that they led toward the direction of an old dirt trail that went deeper into the woods. I didn't follow any farther. I loaded my truck, double-checked the cabin, and left. As I drove away, I kept looking in the mirror. Ranger didn't bark or growl, but he kept his head low, eyes on the window. About halfway down the road, I saw something through the trees, a faint shape moving along the ridge line, keeping pace with the truck. I couldn't make out details through the rain and branches, but it was upright, and it stopped when I stopped. I didn't wait around to figure it out. When I finally reached the main road, I felt the weight lift a little. The feeling of being watched started to fade. I didn't say anything to anyone when I got back home, not at first. A few days later, though, I looked up that area online, just out of curiosity. There had been reports, people finding campsites torn apart, small fires left burning, personal items missing, and once in a while, stories about someone living wild out there. Not ghosts, not monsters, just a person who'd been out there too long, surviving off what they could find. I never went back to that cabin. Sometimes I think about those bare footprints and the way they circled around and around the place, how whoever it was didn't try to break in, just stayed close enough to remind me they were there. Maybe they were watching for food, or maybe they were just lonely. I don't know, but every time I drive past the woods now, I still see them in my head. The prints in the mud, the fog thick around the trees, and the way Ranger's ears stood straight up in the dark, listening to something I couldn't hear. Whatever was out there that week wasn't supernatural. It was just real enough to stay with me. It was early October of 2011 when I decided to take a short break from the city. I had been working nonstop for months, and everything around me felt loud, fast, and cluttered. I wanted quiet, something different. So when a friend mentioned he had a small cabin he rarely used out near a place called Graywood Ridge in northern Idaho, I took him up on it. It was supposed to be simple, a week alone, a bit of hiking, some reading, maybe a few photos of the forest. Nothing more. The drive took longer than I thought. The paved road turned into a narrow dirt path that wound between thick pines and birches, the kind of forest where the light looks permanently dim even during the day. My phone lost signal about an hour before I reached the cabin. The world got quieter with every mile. The cabin itself sat on a slope, hidden behind a patch of tall grass and surrounded by uneven trees that leaned toward it like they were closing in. It looked small from the outside, built out of dark wood that had started to gray from years of weather. The porch was half sunken on one side, and the steps creaked when I climbed them. The windows were dusty, and there were cobwebs in the corners. I remember thinking it felt more like a hunting shack than a cabin meant for staying in. But I was tired, and it wasn't like I had anywhere else to go. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The living area was simple. One couch, one small table, a few old books, a fireplace filled with ash that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The kitchen had a rusty sink, a gas stove, and a single window that faced the woods. There was one bedroom down a short hall and a small bathroom beside it. I unpacked my duffel bag, opened a few windows, and swept the floor with a broom I found leaning against the wall. By the time I was done cleaning, it was late afternoon. The forest outside had a strange stillness to it. I didn't hear any birds or bugs, not even wind moving through the trees. Just silence, thick and steady. It wasn't peaceful. It felt like the quiet you get in places that haven't seen people in a long time. That first night, I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up. The walls made small cracking noises, like the wood was shifting with the temperature. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I could hear something faint outside. A sound like slow steps through grass, too far to be clear but close enough that I couldn't ignore it. I told myself it was probably deer or some other animal. Still, I got up twice just to check through the window. Nothing was there. The second day, I went for a walk around the ridge. The woods were thicker than they looked from the cabin. The ground was soft with dead leaves, and the air smelled damp. A narrow trail ran down toward a dried creek bed, and I followed it for about an hour before turning back. I found an old fence, broken and half buried in moss. It ran in both directions but disappeared into the trees on each side. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I took a few photos, then headed back as the sun dropped low. When I reached the cabin, I noticed something odd. The front door wasn't closed all the way. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. I remembered hearing the click that morning. The latch was hanging loose, the door pushed open just a few inches. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to convince myself the wind could have done it. But it didn't make sense. The door was heavy, and there hadn't been any wind that day. Inside, nothing seemed different at first. My bag was still on the bed, my jacket still hanging on the chair. But when I went into the kitchen, I saw something that stopped me. On the counter, next to the stove, there were small bits of wet dirt, just a few smudges, like someone had set down something muddy. The rest of the counter was clean. I didn't remember leaving that. I wiped it up, checked the back door, and made sure everything was locked again. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept glancing toward the window. Around midnight, I thought I heard something again. Slow crunches on the leaves outside, moving behind the cabin this time. They would stop for a few seconds, then start again. I held still, barely breathing, waiting for it to go away. Eventually it did, or maybe I just fell asleep without realizing it. The next morning, I walked around the back of the cabin. There were footprints in the dirt. Not deep ones, just faint outlines like someone had walked through the area recently. They were boot prints larger than mine. I followed them for about 20 yards before they faded into the leaves and pine needles. I turned back quickly. That day dragged. The quiet that I had wanted so badly started to feel heavier, almost suffocating. Every sound made me turn my head. Every branch falling, every creak in the floor. I didn't feel alone anymore, and I hated how unsure I was about everything I saw. By the fourth day, I knew I couldn't stay the full week. I planned to leave the next morning, but I still had one night left. I stacked a few pieces of wood in the fireplace that evening and lit a small fire. The glow filled the cabin, flickering over the old walls. I sat near it with a blanket wrapped around me, trying to read, trying not to look at the window. Sometime around 2 a.m, I woke up to the sound of the back door handle moving. Not just a creak. It rattled, steady and deliberate. I froze, kept going, quiet metal clicks, like someone was testing if it was locked. I didn't move for a minute. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for something else to happen. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard faint steps walking away, slow and dragging. When daylight came, I packed up as fast as I could. The woods looked different that morning. Too still, too pale, like everything was holding its breath. Before I got in the truck, I looked at the back door again. There were smears of dirt on the handle, fresh ones, like a hand had grabbed it. The drive out was rough. The dirt road looked narrower than before, and I kept checking my mirrors even though I knew no one was behind me. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a kind of relief I hadn't felt in years. I didn't tell anyone much when I got back, just that the place felt off. A week later, out of curiosity, I looked up the property on a county map site. The odd part was, there wasn't supposed to be any other cabin for miles around that ridge, just that one. But the map showed something strange. About 100 yards behind where the cabin sat, in the middle of the woods, there was a small square marked as structure remains. I zoomed in on it. The note said, collapsed dwelling, demolished 1983. I remembered the faint trail behind the cabin that I never followed far. I thought about the footsteps, the handprints, the open door. I never went back to Graywood Ridge after that. I didn't even ask my friend about it. But sometimes when I think about that place, I can't stop wondering whether that cabin I stayed in was really the one he meant to send me to, or if I had ended up in the wrong one entirely.